Hi, I'm John Nunn, and in this video I'm going to talk about the Chess Endgame Exercise Book, a book recently published by Gambit Publications and written by myself. I've written quite a few endgame books, and mostly these did not contain positions for readers to solve. Several people have commented on this, and now I've made up for it by offering an entire book of exercises. There are 444 endgame exercises in the book, which should keep readers busy for quite some time. The printed book has a feature which I quite like. Many books containing large numbers of positions, if you want to look for the solution to, say, position 372, you have to hunt around at the back of the book for that particular solution. But in this book, the positions to solve are all on the right hand side of the page, and then you just have to turn over to get the solutions which are immediately overleaf. But that shouldn't encourage you to cheat by looking at the solutions until you've made a serious attempt to solve the positions for yourself, because that's the way you'll get the most instructional value from the exercises. The difficulty level in this book is fairly high. There are a fair number of 1- and 2-star exercises which are only moderately challenging. 3-, 4- and 5-star exercises are quite difficult, and I would say that the 5-star exercises will probably cause grandmasters to think quite hard. Having said that, there's a great deal of instructional value here. Even if you just make an attempt to solve the positions and then look at the solutions, then you'll learn an enormous amount about the endgame. And, well, I think that most readers will be able to solve at least some of the positions. The book ends with a series of graded exercises or test papers which you can mark, like a school exam, and this will evaluate your endgame skill. And I should add that the getting 90% qualifies you for the "you must be Magnus Carlsen" level. Well, let's have a look at a couple of positions so that you can see what type of things you'll find in the book. I've chosen 2 positions which I think you'll find quite interesting. This first position is white to play. It's a knight ending, and the text says, "At first sight white is in Zugzwang, but he used a brilliant defensive resource to save the game. Can you find it too?" Well, the first thing to work out is why I'm suggesting that white might be in Zugzwang in this position. There aren't a huge number of possible moves. White can either move his knight, or there are 2 possible king moves. But the knight moves really don't get us very far. If the knight goes to d3, for example, black just pushes his pawn. Taking the pawn leads to a lost king and pawn ending, so the king has to go to f1, but then black just takes white's last pawn, and with 2 extra pawns and the g-pawn running through, it's an easy win. So that leaves the 2 king moves. King here also looks poor. Pawn advances and is going to promote. And finally there's king here, then black plays f2, and we have a repeat Zugzwang. If the knight moves, black again takes on h2, and if white moves his king, there's only one square, king e2, and then king g2 promotes the pawn. Well, the position is actually a draw, so there's obviously a flaw in the logic I've just described. So you might like to pause the video at this point and try to work out what was wrong about the explanation I gave earlier. Let's click on the answer link and see what happened in the game. All the positions in this book, apart from 1, are taken from either 2019 or 2020. In the latter case, some from internet events which took place after the lockdown occurred. White found a stunning way to save the game. He did actually play king to f1. Black, of course, can't take on h2 immediately because his pawn on g4 would be hanging. But he plays f2, as I suggested. And now comes the flaw in the logic I described. white can actually move his knight in such a way as to save the pawn on h2 by playing the remarkable move knight f3. Well, the knight defends the pawn, which is fine, but the key point is clearly that black can't take the knight because that would stalemate white. Remarkably, the boot is now on the other foot and it's black who is short of moves. His king has no legal moves at all. If the knight moves, then white just takes on f2. Well, the only remaining possibility is to push the g-pawn straight forward. White takes, black takes, and now white can't move the knight away because of knight d2 check, but king e2 saves the game. If black plays his king to g2, white just starts checking, and he checks again, and that leads to a draw. In the game, black basically gave up his winning attempts and moved his knight away. White played the neat little move knight e1, which prevents king g2, and the knight went away and white came here and gobbled up the black pawn. So this was fine play by white. Nice piece of tactical imagination, seeing that stalemate was the resource he needed to save what apparently was a lost position. As I say, that was a 2-star exercise. Let's now look at something a little bit more difficult, a 3-star exercise. Well, here the text just says, find the only drawing move for white. Here you might like to pause the video and think about which is the only move to save the game. Right, let's click on the answer link and see what happened. In the game, white played what is perhaps the most natural move. He pushed his own passed pawn. He played e4. The idea is to get his pawn as far advanced as he can before he has to give up the rook for black's a pawn, something that will inevitably occur. It seems like a reasonable plan, but it actually loses. Let's see why. Game continued with white, as I say, giving up his rook. And now white actually played e5, and this allows black an immediate win with an idea which I call in this book the 5th rank cutoff. Black could have played his rook to black's 5th rank, that is to say the square h4, cutting the white king off along the rank from his own pawn. And now it's a win for black no matter where his king is, because it doesn't matter how many tempi white has, he can't bring his king in contact with the pawn, and nor can he push the pawn, because if the pawn advances, it's lost. Black just attacks it with his rook, and the pawn falls. Well, black actually played a different move, which allows white to escape, but this 5th rank cutoff idea is very, very common in rook and pawn endings, and it's part of what I would describe as essential knowledge. It's interesting to see why white loses if he plays perhaps slightly more challenging move, king f4. This move is designed to avoid the 5th rank cutoff by advancing the king and pawn in tandem, but it nevertheless loses because black rushes back with his king. Now, if the pawn advances, the rook comes behind it and wins it. If the king moves up again, black is in good time to bring his king back and win the pawn. Well, when I say in good time, I mean by one tempo. And the main reason why this line lost was that black was able to bring his king up to attack the pawn very quickly. So if we go back to the diagram position, it's remarkable that the only move to draw is to put the king in front of the pawn. It's perhaps not a natural move. The pawn is blocked temporarily, and at first sight it seems that white's going to lose 2 tempi. So he now has to move the king again before he can push the pawn. But when white moves his king, he's going to move it to the left of the pawn. In the previous line, the white king ended up to the right of the pawn and wasn't able to do anything to stop black's king from rushing back to attack the pawn. If the white king is to the left of the pawn, the white king will make it much more difficult for black to race back with his king. It's an idea which is commonly called shouldering away, and it's important in several different types of ending, not only in rook endings. Okay, let's see what happens. White has to give up the rook for the pawn in the same way. But now the white king is moved to a fairly advanced position, so he's going ahead of the pawn. It avoids the fifth rank cutoff. Also the king is to the left of the pawn, so as to shoulder away the black king. So now black wins the rook as before. And now we can see the crucial difference. The king on d5 prevents the black king from closing in on the white pawn, and now white is actually quite safe because he can play e7, king d6, king d7, and after a few more moves, for example something like this, it's time for black to come back with his rook, and white goes here and then promotes the pawn and wins the rook with a draw. So just this one example contained a number of interesting features. First of all, the essential knowledge of the fifth rank cutoff, and second, the importance of the shouldering away idea. So as well, it means that in many positions it's worth spending some time in order to improve the position of your king, and put it on a square where it prevents the enemy king from occupying an active position itself. It's a kind of it's like there can only be one. Only one king can occupy an active position. It's either white's king or black's king. If white occupies the high ground to the left of his pawn straight away, it prevents black from arriving at the same position with his own king. Well, that was a 3-star exercise. If you want to see a 4 or 5-star exercise, I'm afraid you're going to have to buy the book. Anyhow, I hope you found those two entertaining, and thank you for looking at this video.